for 4.5 years, something extraordinary was happening right under the nose of the British welfare system. While millions of people relied on universal credit to survive, a criminal network was quietly draining it, claim by claim, payment by payment. By the time it ended, nearly $54 million had vanished, public money, taxpayer money, money meant for the most vulnerable. That money didn't disappear into the shadows. It resurfaced in plain sight, thousands of miles away, in a small Bulgarian city called Sliven. Mansions rose in neighborhoods once marked by poverty. Luxury cars appeared on broken roads. Weddings cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Cash flowed freely, openly, almost carelessly. At the center of it all was Galina Nikolova, a woman running what looked like an ordinary translation and advice business in North London. On paper, everything appeared legitimate, but behind the paperwork was one of the largest benefit fraud operations ever uncovered in the UK. For years, no alarm was raised, no system stopped it, no authority noticed the scale. Until one man did. During the COVID lockdowns, a Bulgarian police officer began asking a simple question. How could people with no visible income suddenly be living like this? That question would expose a scheme so vast it would shock British authorities and reveal just how fragile the system really was. This is the true story of greed, deception, and a failure that lasted 1,642 days. And it all started with someone noticing that the numbers didn't make sense. To understand how this fraud was able to grow so large for so long, you have to look at two very different places, linked by money, paperwork, and a system built on trust. The first place is Wood Green, North London. Wood Green is not wealthy. It's a busy, working-class area, home to one of the most diverse communities in the capital. Along its high streets are small offices offering translation services, immigration advice, help with housing, and assistance with government forms. For many migrants arriving in the UK, places like this are essential. They help people navigate a system that can be confusing, especially if English is not their first language. In 2016, the UK government began rolling out universal credit, a major overhaul of the welfare system. It was designed to replace multiple benefits with a single monthly payment. The idea was simple: make the system easier, faster, and more accessible for people in need. But the new system was also largely digital. Claims were submitted online. Documents were uploaded electronically. Identity checks were limited. Much of the system relied on information provided by the claimant, with checks happening later, if they happened at all. By the time universal credit was fully operational, the UK was facing pressures it hadn't anticipated. Brexit reshaped immigration patterns and strained public services. Then in 2020, COVID-19 hit. Millions lost work almost overnight. Benefit claims surged to record levels. Government departments were overwhelmed. Speed became the priority. The system had to pay people quickly or risk leaving families with nothing. In this environment, scrutiny weakened. Businesses offering help with benefit applications became more common. Many were legitimate. Some were not. And for criminals who understood the system's gaps, the opportunity was obvious. While claims were being processed quietly in London, approved by computers and automated checks, the money began flowing out of the UK. And that brings us to the second place, Sliven, Bulgaria. Sliven is a regional city of around 90,000 people, located at the foot of the Balkan Mountains. Once known for its textile industry, the city had suffered long-term economic decline after the collapse of communism. Jobs disappeared, wages stagnated, many residents left to seek work abroad. One of Sliven's largest districts is Nadezhda. For years, it was associated with overcrowding, poverty, and limited opportunities. Infrastructure was poor, houses were often unfinished.
Families survived day to day, with little sign of wealth. Then, around 2020, during Bulgaria's COVID lockdowns, something changed. Money appeared suddenly and visibly. Homes that had stood half-built for years were completed almost overnight. New mansions rose behind ornate gates. Luxury cars, Audis, BMWs, Mercedes, filled streets where old vehicles had once struggled over broken roads. Weddings became extravagant events, with performers reportedly paid tens of thousands of euros for a single appearance. Cash was spent openly. For a country in lockdown, the contrast was impossible to ignore. And one person did notice. Inspector Vassil Panayotov, an officer with Sliven's organized crime unit, had spent years investigating financial crime. During the pandemic, as movement was restricted and businesses were closed, he began to see a pattern that didn't add up. People with no registered employment were living extraordinarily well. Families with no declared income were building large homes. The scale was not occasional, it was widespread. Later, Panayotov would explain that it wasn't one mansion or one car that raised suspicion, it was the sheer number of them, all appearing at once in the same neighborhoods. He began asking questions. Where was the money coming from? Who was sending it? And how could so many people afford this lifestyle during a lockdown? And what he would eventually uncover was not a local mystery, but a trail of public money stretching all the way back to the UK. And that trail would lead directly into the heart of Britain's welfare system.
Every large fraud has a structure, leaders, helpers, and a system that allows it to operate. In this case, the people involved were not hiding in the shadows. They were operating openly, confidently, and for years without interference. At the center of the operation was Galina Nikolova. By the time of her arrest, Nikolova was 38 years old. In North London, she ran what appeared to be a legitimate translation and advice business. To customers, she offered help with paperwork, national insurance numbers, benefit applications, correspondence with authorities. On the surface, it looked like a service many migrants genuinely need. But investigators would later establish that Nikolova played a leading role in a fraud that caused losses of around £25 million on its own. When police searched her flat in Wood Green, they found more than £750,000 in cash, hidden throughout the apartment. The money was not locked away, it was simply there, stuffed into suitcases, drawers, and furniture, evidence of how normalized the crime had become. Working alongside her was Gyunesh Ali. Ali was younger, 33 at the time, but prosecutors described him as the architect of the scheme. He understood the universal credit system in detail. He identified its weaknesses, trained others, and designed a process that could be repeated thousands of times. According to the prosecution, Ali laid the foundations of the operation as early as 2016 and showed others how to exploit it efficiently. Video evidence later shown to the court captured Ali openly celebrating his wealth, throwing banknotes into the air. It was not secrecy that protected him, it was confidence that the system would not catch up. Below them was a group of trusted associates. Stoyan Stoyanov arrived in Bulgaria in 2020. Within weeks, he became deeply involved in the operation. Investigators linked him to fraudulent claims worth more than £6 million. Prosecutors said he understood exactly what he was doing and played a key role in managing claims and documentation. Svetka Todorova, older than the others, ran her own smaller operation connected to the wider network. She would later claim she did not know the other defendants, a claim disproven by messages and financial records. When arrests began, she attempted to leave the UK, booking a one-way ticket back to Bulgaria. The youngest member was Patricia Paneva. She was recruited at just 19 years old. Initially, she was paid modestly, around £80 a day, to help process claims. As the operation grew, so did her role. Her phone number was later found to be the contact point for hundreds of fraudulent applications. By the time of her arrest, she was 26. Together, these individuals formed the core of what prosecutors described as an industrial-scale fraud operation, one that processed thousands of claims with assembly line efficiency. But while this network was operating in London, another key figure was emerging elsewhere. Back in Bulgaria, Inspector Vassil Panayotov was not looking for a UK benefits fraud. He was simply doing his job. Vassil Panayotov was 47 years old and worked in Sliven's organized crime unit. During the pandemic lockdowns, he noticed a contradiction that wouldn't go away. People with no visible income were spending enormous sums of money. Entire streets were changing almost overnight. He began to compare lifestyles with official records. The numbers didn't match. Where there should have been wages, there were none. Where there should have been businesses, there were few. Yet the money kept coming, and it wasn't hidden, it was displayed. Panayotov started asking questions, quietly at first, then more formally. What he uncovered were early signs that thousands of people in the Sliven region were receiving money from the UK welfare system, often without ever having lived or worked there. That discovery would eventually bring British and Bulgarian authorities together and expose the true scale of the operation. And then there were the victims. Not individuals in the traditional sense, but millions of taxpayers whose contributions funded the system, and legitimate universal credit claimants who would later face stricter checks because of fraud like this. The system had been designed to help people in need. Instead, it had been turned into a revenue stream, one that paid for luxury, excess, and years of unchecked criminal profit. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, tens of millions of pounds were already gone. For years, the fraud moved quietly through the UK's welfare system, processed not by criminals in masks, but by computers and civil servants doing their jobs. The operation focused on universal credit, a system introduced to simplify benefits into a single monthly payment. Applications were made online. Supporting documents were uploaded digitally. Decisions were often automated. In normal circumstances, this speed helped people who needed urgent support. The gang learned how to turn that speed into a weakness. Using false identities and real identities taken under their control, they submitted thousands of benefit claims. Each claim was supported by forged paperwork, tenancy agreements for properties that didn't exist, pay slips from employers that were never registered, letters from GP surgeries and schools that had never issued them. When claims were rejected, they were adjusted and submitted again. Court records later showed that the same addresses, documents, and wording were reused repeatedly, altered just enough to avoid detection. The process became routine. Claims were prepared in batches. Payments followed predictable schedules. Many of the people named on these applications were not living in Britain. Some had never lived there at all. Others were brought into the UK briefly to open bank accounts or attend appointments, then sent back to Bulgaria while payments continued in their names. Once the claim was active, control was transferred entirely to members of the gang based in London. The money was no longer theirs. Between 2016 and 2021, more than 6,000 fraudulent claims were approved. According to the Department for Work and Pensions, the total loss exceeded £54 million. In court, prosecutors described the scheme as systematic, deliberate, and sustained over years. Communication within the group was constant. Messages recovered from mobile phones showed detailed coordination through WhatsApp, instructions on submitting claims, reminders about deadlines, and discussions about which applications had been successful. Some messages showed a casual attitude toward the fraud, reflecting confidence that the system would continue to pay out. Once the money arrived, it moved quickly. Funds were withdrawn in cash or transferred through multiple accounts before being sent abroad. Large sums ended up in Bulgaria, where they were spent openly and without restraint. In Sliven, the contrast was impossible to miss. Homes expanded into gated properties. New buildings appeared in neighborhoods known for poverty. Expensive cars were parked on streets where official incomes had barely changed. Weddings and celebrations were held on a scale that far exceeded anything the local economy could support.
This visibility became the gang's weakness. Inspector Vassil Panayotov, who had already begun questioning the sudden wealth he was seeing, started documenting it. He compared declared incomes with physical evidence, properties, vehicles, construction work. The numbers did not match. As his enquiries continued, a pattern emerged. Money was arriving from the United Kingdom month after month into accounts held by people with no legitimate reason to receive it. Panayotov compiled photographs, financial records, and intelligence reports. He raised concerns through official channels and shared what he had found with British authorities. What had begun as benefit claims processed quietly in London had become a clear flow of public money leaving the UK. By the time British investigators began to re-examine the claims, the fraud was already years old. But once the pattern was recognized, it could no longer be ignored.
By the time the fraud reached the attention of British authorities, it was no longer just a suspicion, it was a pattern. In Bulgaria, Inspector Vassil Panayotov formally raised his concerns within the organized crime unit. His team began compiling data on individuals in and around Sliven who appeared to be receiving money from the United Kingdom. When the numbers were reviewed, the scale was unexpected. More than 2,000 people in the region were linked to UK benefit payments. On paper, many of them had little or no declared income. In reality, they were building houses, buying vehicles, and spending freely. Panayotov and his colleagues compared tax records with visible assets. The discrepancies were consistent and widespread. This was no longer about a handful of suspicious cases. It was systemic. Panayotov escalated the matter through official channels and contacted the British Embassy, outlining his findings and expressing concern that UK public funds were being abused on a large scale. At first, the response from the UK side was cautious. The Department for Work and Pensions had not identified losses of this magnitude. Universal credit claims were processed centrally, and many of the payments appeared legitimate within the system. There was no single alert, no obvious trigger. From the UK perspective, the allegation sounded improbable, but the Bulgarian evidence kept growing. As more information was shared, British investigators began quietly re-examining clusters of claims linked to the same addresses, the same advisors, and the same supporting documents. Patterns emerged that had not been visible when cases were viewed individually. What followed was a joint investigation. Surveillance was authorized in London. Investigators monitored offices and apartments connected to the suspected organizers. Financial records were analyzed. Bank accounts were mapped. Digital footprints were traced. When warrants were eventually executed, the scale of material recovered surprised even experienced investigators. More than 900 digital devices were seized: phones, laptops, hard drives. Thousands of documents were collected, many of them forged. Tenancy agreements, payslips, letters, templates used again and again. WhatsApp conversations revealed how the operation functioned day to day. Instructions were passed down, problems were discussed, claims were tracked. It was no longer guesswork. The mechanics of the fraud were laid bare. As evidence accumulated, the investigation widened. British and Bulgarian authorities coordinated their findings, linking money flows from London to Sliven. Public funds, intended for welfare support, were traced through accounts and into physical assets abroad. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. The sums involved were too large to ignore. The duration of the fraud raised questions about oversight and safeguards. Internally, departments began preparing for the consequences of what would soon become public. Raids were planned, arrests were prepared. What had once seemed like an unlikely theory, benefit fraud on an industrial scale, was now supported by documents, data, and testimony. And for the first time in nearly 5 years, the operation faced real interruption.
The turning point came in early May 2021. By then, investigators in the UK had gathered enough evidence to act. Surveillance had confirmed the locations of key members of the group. Digital analysis had linked thousands of fraudulent benefit claims to the same small network of organizers. On May 5, 2021, coordinated raids were carried out across London. Officers entered offices and residential apartments connected to the operation. Inside, they found what the paperwork had suggested all along: large quantities of forged documents, stacks of printed claim forms, laptops and mobile phones used to manage the fraud. Cash was recovered. In total, more than £750,000 was seized during the searches, alongside luxury items that could not be explained by legitimate income. For investigators, it was confirmation that the fraud was not abstract. The money was real, physical, and close at hand. Not everyone was caught immediately. Gyunesh Ali, identified in court as one of the architects of the scheme, was no longer in the UK. He had traveled to Bulgaria shortly before the raids and did not return. Efforts to locate him began almost immediately. Others attempted to leave. Galina Nikolova and Svetka Todorova both tried to avoid arrest after the operation was exposed. Their movements were tracked, and they were detained before they could escape the investigation. As arrests were made in London, the work in Bulgaria continued. Inspector Vassil Panayotov remained focused on tracing the money. He continued to provide intelligence on properties, bank transfers, and individuals connected to the proceeds of the fraud. His role helped link physical assets in Bulgaria to benefit claims made in the UK. What had once been scattered suspicions was now a single case file. The WhatsApp messages recovered from seized devices showed the structure of the group. The documents showed how the fraud had been repeated thousands of times. The cash and property showed where the money had gone. By the end of May 2021, the operation that had drained millions from the UK welfare system for nearly 5 years had effectively collapsed. What remained was the task of prosecution and the question of how such a scheme had been allowed to run for so long.
By April 2024, the case reached the courtroom in Wood Green Crown Court. All 5 defendants, facing overwhelming evidence, entered guilty pleas. Charges included conspiracy to commit fraud, possession of articles for use in fraud, and money laundering. The prosecution described the operation as one of the largest benefit frauds ever prosecuted in England and Wales. Over 6,000 claims had been submitted, with losses to the Department for Work and Pensions exceeding £54 million. The court noted the scale, duration, and planning involved. Sentences were delivered as follows. Galina Nikolova, identified as a leading figure responsible for approximately £25 million of the fraud, received 8 years in prison. Gyunesh Ali, the architect of the scheme, who had previously fled to Bulgaria, was sentenced in absentia to 7 years and 3 months. He was later extradited to serve his sentence in the UK. Stoyan Stoyanov, a trusted subordinate responsible for significant fraudulent claims, received 4 years. Svetka Todorova, who had attempted to leave the country and had independently carried out smaller-scale fraud, received 3 years. Patricia Paneva, the youngest member, initially recruited at 19, was sentenced to 3 years and 2 months. During sentencing, the judge highlighted not only the actions of the defendants, but also the systemic weaknesses that allowed the scheme to operate for more than 4 years. The universal credit system, designed to support vulnerable families, had been exploited repeatedly. Checks and balances failed to identify or halt the fraud in its early stages. The court emphasized that the sentences reflected both the scale of the crime and the need to deter similar operations in the future. Credit was given for guilty pleas, which allowed the prosecution to avoid a full trial. Meanwhile, Inspector Vassil Panayotov received recognition for his work in uncovering the scheme. His early observations and intelligence sharing between Bulgarian and UK authorities were noted as crucial to dismantling the network and recovering evidence. Public statements and media coverage highlighted his role in bringing cross-border attention to the fraud.
By the conclusion of the trial, the case had exposed not only the individuals behind the fraud, but also the broader vulnerabilities within the UK welfare system and the challenges of detecting large-scale, cross-border financial crimes. By the conclusion of the trial, only a small portion of the stolen funds had been recovered. Around £1 million had been reclaimed, while £53 million remained unaccounted for, believed to be dispersed in Bulgaria or invested in assets outside immediate reach. The Department for Work and Pensions responded by introducing new safeguards. Artificial intelligence and data analytics now help identify suspicious claims, and international cooperation protocols have been strengthened to track cross-border benefit fraud more effectively. The social impact was widespread. UK taxpayers lost millions, legitimate claimants faced stricter checks, and the Bulgarian community in Sliven was affected in both tangible and reputational ways. Mansions and luxury cars highlighted the stark contrast between lawful citizens and those who benefited from the scheme. This case was never victimless. Every pound stolen was intended to support vulnerable families. It took the keen observation of one officer in Bulgaria, Inspector Vassil Panayotov, to uncover what had gone unnoticed by an entire government department for more than 4 years. His diligence was essential in bringing the fraudsters to justice. The story also raises broader questions about systemic weaknesses, cross-border financial crimes, and the balance between accessibility and oversight in public welfare systems. If this story shocked you or made you think about how public systems can be exploited, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And don't forget to tune in next week, where we'll uncover another case of fraud and deception that stretched across borders.